You said it out loud once, just once. A product name, a brand, something you'd never searched for, never typed, never even thought about in weeks. And within hours, maybe less, it showed up on your screen. An ad, perfectly placed, perfectly timed. And your first thought was the same thought 30 million other people had this year. My phone is listening to me. But here's what nobody is telling you. That's not what happened. What actually happened is worse. Because if your phone were simply listening, you could turn off the microphone and be safe. You can't. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the thing you're afraid of isn't even the real threat. Let's start with the uncomfortable part. Every major investigation into this phenomenon, the kind involving forensic engineers cracking open phones and monitoring outgoing data in real time, has found the same result. Your microphone is not secretly recording your conversations and shipping them to advertisers. That myth persists because it's the simplest explanation for something that feels impossible to explain otherwise. But simple explanations are often wrong. This one is spectacularly wrong. What's actually happening is more disturbing because it means the system doesn't need to hear you at all. It already knows you. Read that again. It already knows you. Here's where the real story begins. Every phone you own, whether it runs iOS or Android, has a hidden identifier buried inside it. On Apple devices, it's called the IDFA, the identifier for advertisers. On Android, it's called the GAID, the Google Advertising ID. Think of it as an invisible barcode stitched into your device the moment it activates. This isn't your name. It isn't your phone number. It's something more useful to advertisers than either of those things because it moves silently between every app you open, invisible, always active, always watching which apps you use, how long you use them, and what you do inside them. And this is where everything changes. That barcode doesn't need your voice. It has your behavior. And behavior, tracked across hundreds of data points a day, predicts what you're about to want before you've said a word. Think about what that actually means for a second. You open a fitness app in the morning, you check a weather app before lunch, you scroll a shopping app during your break, you watch 3 cooking videos before dinner. Individually, these look like nothing. Together, stitched to the same invisible identifier, they build something advertisers call a behavioral profile, and it is frighteningly precise. It knows your routines before you're conscious of having them. It knows your spending patterns before your bank does. And when that coffee maker ad appears, the same day you mentioned wanting one out loud, it's not because a microphone caught your words. It's because the system already predicted you'd want it, based on months of silent tracking that had nothing to do with your voice and everything to do with a chain of tiny signals you never noticed you were sending. But here's where it gets worse. This tracking didn't used to require your permission. For years, this identifier operated by default. Apps could access it, share it, sell it, and combine it with dozens of other trackers without asking you a single question. You had to go digging through settings menus. Most people never opened to even discover the option existed, and almost nobody did. According to what privacy researchers have documented extensively, the vast majority of users never touched these controls, not because they didn't care, but because they had no idea the control existed in the first place. The system wasn't hiding in shadows. It was hiding in plain sight, buried 3 menus deep, where convenience was designed to keep you from ever finding it. That changed, but only partially, and only recently, in the broader scope of how long this tracking economy has existed. Apple introduced what's called App Tracking Transparency, a framework that finally forces apps to ask your permission before accessing that identifier and following you across other apps. Sounds like a win. And in some ways, it is. When ATT rolled out, it fundamentally cracked the old advertising model. Apps could no longer quietly stitch your identity together behind your back without at least asking first. But here's the part that should make you pause. Asking isn't the same as stopping. Every time an app throws up that little pop-up asking whether it can track you across other companies, most users, out of habit, out of fatigue, out of simply wanting the pop-up to disappear, tap allow without reading a word. This is not chaos. This is strategy. The friction was added. The behavior wasn't changed. And that gap between the two is exactly where the tracking economy has learned to survive. Now think about what's happening on the other side, on Android, which runs the vast majority of phones on Earth. Google's advertising identifier operates on a different philosophy, one that leans more heavily on you finding the opt-out yourself rather than being asked up front. It sits inside your Google account settings, several taps deep, framed in language that sounds optional rather than urgent. And because it doesn't interrupt you with a pop-up the way Apple's system does, most Android users go their entire ownership of a device without ever knowing this identifier exists, let alone that it can be reset or deleted. What most people are not seeing is that 2 of the largest mobile ecosystems on the planet handle the exact same threat with 2 completely different levels of visibility. The platform you happen to use quietly determines how exposed you are without you ever choosing that outcome. Here's where the story escalates again, because tracking identifiers are only half of what's watching you. The other half lives in permissions, the quiet yes or no questions. Your phone asked you the first time you installed an app, questions you probably answered in half a second without thinking, because you wanted to get to the app and stop seeing the pop-up. Microphone access, camera access, location, even when you're not using the app, contacts, photos. Every one of those permissions, once granted, tends to stay granted indefinitely, silently in the background, long after you've forgotten you ever gave it. According to permission audits conducted across major app stores, a significant share of installed apps request microphone or camera access they don't functionally need for their core purpose. And once granted, that access rarely gets revisited by the person who gave it. And this is where everything changes again, because permissions don't need to be actively abused to be dangerous, they just need to exist. An app with standing microphone access doesn't need to record you talking about a product to be a threat. It needs the ability to activate that microphone under conditions you never fully understood when you tapped, allowed 2 years ago and forgot the screen ever appeared. Investigators who've monitored real-time data traffic from phones have documented cases of apps quietly accessing microphones during hours when no legitimate use should have been occurring, sometimes at 3 in the morning, sometimes during moments with no corresponding in-app activity that would explain why the access happened at all. Nobody proved these were recording conversations for advertising, but the access itself, unexplained and unnoticed, is the entire point. You gave permission once, you never revoked it, and the system was never designed to remind you that you should. Let's escalate further, because there's a piece of this that almost nobody outside the industry understands. Even without your microphone, even without your GPS being active, your phone assembles what's essentially a fingerprint of you using dozens of smaller signals working together. The specific model of your device, your screen resolution, your battery level, your network carrier. The exact sequence of apps you open in a day. Individually harmless, combined, unique enough to identify you with startling accuracy, even if every single tracking identifier were switched off. This is called device fingerprinting, and it's one of the reasons privacy experts warn that simply resetting your advertising ID isn't a complete solution. It disrupts the primary tracking method. It does not erase you from the system entirely. Think about what that means. You can pull one thread of this and the fabric doesn't fall apart. It just reweaves itself around you. So why is 2026 the year this conversation has become urgent instead of theoretical? According to recent consumer research, the majority of smartphone users now report manually adjusting privacy settings on their own, a dramatic shift from just a few years ago when most people left every default setting untouched. Lawmakers have taken notice too. More than a dozen U.S. states have passed data privacy legislation in the past 2 years alone, each one forcing companies to disclose more about what they collect and giving users stronger legal footing to demand deletion. And a growing share of the public, well over 80% according to recent surveys, now report genuine concern about how their personal data is being pulled into AI training systems, a threat that didn't even meaningfully exist in the public conversation 5 years ago. This is not a niche concern anymore. This is a mainstream reckoning arriving all at once on a system that was built for over a decade without anyone watching closely enough to stop it. Here's the power shift, and it's the part of this story most people skip past too quickly. For the first time since smartphones became the center of daily life, the tools to meaningfully disrupt this tracking machinery sit inside your settings app right now, today, requiring no technical skill, no paid app, no workaround. On an iPhone, opening privacy and security settings and finding the tracking section lets you see and shut off every app currently permitted to follow you across others, in addition to resetting the advertising identifier itself. So any existing profile built on the old one becomes worthless. But the microphone question deserves its own moment, because this is where the fear has always been loudest, even if the mechanism has been misunderstood. On newer versions of Android, there's a system-wide toggle sitting in your quick settings panel. Oh, the same panel you pull down to adjust brightness or turn on airplane mode that can kill microphone access for every single app on your phone simultaneously with one tap. Not app by app, all at once. And beyond that single switch, a permission manager buried in your privacy settings lets you walk through every app that currently holds microphone or camera access and revoke it individually, app by app, for anything that hasn't used it in weeks. On iPhones, the same audit exists inside privacy and security settings, broken down permission by permission, showing you in plain terms exactly which apps can currently hear you, see you, or find you, whether you remember granting that access or not. And here's a detail that changes how you should think about voice assistants specifically. If your phone has a wake word feature active, the kind that listens constantly for a phrase like, "Hey Google," or its equivalent, that feature runs a limited localized listening process at all times by design, because that's the only way a wake word can function. It's not sending your conversations to advertisers, but it is running a persistent listening state on your device that most users never chose deliberately. They simply left it on because it was on by default when they set up the phone. Turning that specific feature off inside your voice assistant settings doesn't just save battery. It closes one of the only doors in this entire system where your microphone genuinely is in a listening state around the clock, waiting for a trigger that could, in theory, misfire. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it reframes everything you just heard. None of this, not the advertising identifiers, not the permission systems, not the tracking transparency prompts, none of it is illegal. None of it is a glitch. None of it is a rogue app breaking the rules. This is the system working exactly as it was designed to work, by companies that built entire empires on the premise that your attention and your behavior are the product being sold long before you ever open the app to buy something yourself. What most people are not seeing is that outrage at my phone is listening to me has actually protected this system for years, because it points fear at a threat that doesn't exist while leaving the real infrastructure, the identifiers, the permissions, the fingerprinting, completely unchallenged and untouched. And this is where the consequences get bigger than a single unsettling ad. According to informed privacy research, this same profiling infrastructure doesn't stay contained to advertising. Data brokers, companies you've never heard of and never agreed to interact with, purchase behavioral profiles built from these same tracking systems and resell them to a widening circle of buyers, including insurance companies assessing risk, employers running background checks, and in some documented cases, government agencies acquiring data through purchase rather than warrant, sidestepping the legal protections that would normally require judicial oversight. The advertising identifier that shows you a coffee maker ad is the same infrastructure capable of being repurposed into something with far higher stakes than a targeted product. Think about what that means. The next time someone tells you targeted ads are a harmless convenience. So where does this leave you? Sitting there right now with a phone in your hand that has been quietly building a profile of you since the day you first turned it on. The fix isn't complicated, and that's almost the most frustrating part of this entire story. Reset or delete your advertising identifier on iPhone through privacy and tracking settings, on Android through your Google account's ad settings, and do it as a habit, not a one-time event, because these identifiers regenerate value over time the longer they're left untouched. Walk through your permission manager and revoke camera and microphone. Deny tracking requests by default when apps ask permission to follow you across others. Rather than tapping, allow out of habit just to make the pop-up disappear. None of this takes more than 10 minutes. None of it requires downloading anything. It requires only the thing most people have never been given, which is the knowledge that these settings exist at all and the reason they matter. But here's the uncertainty this leaves behind, and it's worth sitting with instead of rushing past. Every fix described here disrupts the current system, the one built around advertising identifiers and permission requests you can see and revoke. But the industry adapting around app tracking transparency has already shown what happens when one tracking method gets restricted. It doesn't disappear, it evolves into something less visible. Device fingerprinting, the quieter method built from dozens of small technical signals rather than one identifiable tag, is growing precisely because the old method became too easy to shut off, which raises the question nobody in this conversation wants to answer directly. If today's fix works by closing the doors, we can see what happens when the next generation of tracking is built specifically around doors we can't. And that's the part of this story that isn't finished yet, because it can't be. The companies building these systems aren't standing still while you adjust 4 settings on a Saturday afternoon. The regulations passing in state legislatures right now are already being tested against systems evolving faster than the laws written to contain them. And the deeper unease sitting underneath all of this, the one connecting advertising tracking to AI training data, to data brokers, to information moving through channels never meant for public accountability, suggests this was never really about one unsettling ad appearing at the wrong moment. It was about a structure quietly built around you for over a decade. One door, one identifier, one forgotten permission at a time, and the uncomfortable truth is that closing the doors you know about tonight doesn't tell you how many doors are still being built that you don't know about yet. So the real question was never whether your phone is listening. The real question is what else has been watching this entire time, and whether the version of privacy you just reclaimed will still mean anything a year from now.